All right, welcome to the Executive Committee of the Council. Today is Tuesday, December 12th, and I do detect a quorum. I appreciate Pro Tem Suara, Chair Stiles, Chair Sepulveda, Chair Parker being present. Here comes Chair Porterfield. Thank you, Chair Porterfield. We may have other committee chairs and members en route. I did want to express our appreciation and understanding for why Chair Gamble is not here today. Obviously, she's working very hard in her district, and I appreciate all members, especially including Chair Sepulveda and Pro Tem Suara and others for supporting council members in their districts. With that, I wanted also to let chairs know that Elise Waller will be reaching out to you. So in January, I would like just to kind of have a touch base and catch up meeting with each of you, just as far as kind of, how it's been going in committee, any suggestions that you might have, and as we look ahead for 2024. So be on the lookout for that so that we can get together and have those conversations. Okay, so with that, since we are running behind, we are going to move right into our second matter on our agenda, engaging a lobbyist for the council. So as members may remember, in the last budget cycle, then Budget Chair Roden did, in conversation with council and the administration at the time, look to have specific funding for council to engage a lobbyist. I think not knowing the manner in which we would do so, that was a fairly significant budget item, or line item, which sort of begged the question, how are we going to approach that? So it's budgeted at $150K. I do not think, based on the kind of pathways and the proposals that I'm going to share with you, that we will need to avail ourselves of that significant an investment. I think if we approach this as contracted services, that's going to be more in the $50K space for a period of a year is pretty typical. Whether that be a specific conversation we're having, looking at existing contracts, just talking to folks in kind of a general informational space. And so I think I shared with you all maybe last time when we met in October that I was just having some informational conversations with some of our state partners, other people who had worked in a lobbyist space, not necessarily for Metro, but just to kind of understand that space best I could and get some feedback on that. And then as well, we were also waiting for this mayor's administration to be in place and understand kind of what was going to be their intent and approach for their own lobbying. Members will recall, but I will just for public awareness, council did engage the last time that the mayor's office sort of updated how they do lobbying to express some concern and a desire for some intention around having a proactive engagement with the council, right? So that we were proactively watching to see if there were bills that we had passed, whether 2, 3, 4, 5 years prior, that might be preempted, if there were actions that would have implications on the work of the council. And so I do appreciate, as kind of constructed in a package such as it was of multiple lobbyists, that there was intention around reporting to council. The feedback that I've gotten, I personally felt as a member of the body, comparative to the previous contracted lobbyist, we got reports like 80 pages long of all kinds of bills, but it was a little, it was more tailored, I think, to the concerns and the requests of the council. And so kind of with that, I guess, in mind, or an awareness that that was still in place or kind of not in place as we understood it coming into this term and wanting to know what a new mayor's administration would be doing. Would they be using the existing contracts? We all know that Mr. Representative Jernigan is now in the mayor's office, right? And that presents some new opportunities and kind of a different approach, right? So wanting to understand from him what their intent was as far as existing contracts. And in having those conversations, I do feel like, they're recognizing this is sort of a in-between time, right? It's a transition time. It's a new administration, whether for Mr. Jernigan and his role, he's got another year and so forth. So as we understand it, they are going to use existing contracts. And so when we then started to look at, even prior to our most recent conversations about, what process could we follow? We had what, at the time, when we were initially talking about this and broaching this, kind of two pathways, and that would be a traditional procurement process and with a proposed scope of services that will be valid, members, for whatever approach we choose. And that's kind of before you hear for your consideration, and I'll touch on that just shortly. And then alternatively, a kind of, internally conducted, I wouldn't call it a procurement process. Ms. Darby, what would you call the internal process by which we might have pursued?
It would be a competitive procurement, but just not utilizing the procurement department, the purchasing department, the purchasing agent.
Correct.
We would do it internally.
So that would be independent, but that would have to be affirmed by a 3-reading ordinance. So I think, as we initially broached it and thought like, well, let's come up with how would it be if we were to, and I think we started to lean to doing it internally, but then when we looked at the time frame of that, best case scenario through that process, though we would have more kind of ownership of it. Hello, Chair Evans, welcome. Though we would have more ownership of it with the initiating the RFP, the time for the response to the RFP, right? Even compressing that time frame with our new January cycle at best, we would be looking at March 7th.
Boy.
Okay?
Yeah.
And then, so once we gamed that out, then we looked at the procurement process. Ms. Darby was kind to be in touch with procurement. Best case scenario there, 90 to 120 days. And so then we kind of got into the existing contracts, and that is a third pathway, and this is the pathway that I'm going to propose to members as being what I would prefer to do. We talked about earlier kind of the Frost Brown Todd umbrella of contracted lobbyist services, underneath which there were other individual contracts. There's Mr. Morrison, Mr. Schmidt, so it's sort of a team, as we know, returning members led on the mayor's office side by Ms. Hauser, and with Frost Brown Todd being kind of the umbrella. Again, the mayor's office, I think now under the name Nelson Mullins, no longer Frost Brown Todd, so doing business as, they are retaining that contract. But there is an independent contract under that umbrella, which we had understood by the previous administration, some conversations in the transition. Ms. Darby had understood that that contract had been canceled. That contract was not canceled. It actually is still an active contract, and as procured, the services can be rendered metro-wide. So we can, in conversation with the mayor's office, as a friendly amendment to that contract, with a scope of services specific to the council and only for the council, we can friendly amend that contract. And then I would suggest as well, have that be within a specific time frame. I am not asking members to affirm something that we are doing for this whole entire term, right? We are in a transition phase, and speaking with Mr. Jernigan, I think they feel similarly. They are in a transition phase, so right, they're using a contract from the existing administration. I am proposing that we likewise do the same, but we amend that in a way that is specific to and advantageous to the conduct of the council, so that it is very clear that whomever we contract with is working for the council, right? So that is a catch-up on kind of where we are. And so I guess at this juncture, I would ask that we review the scope of services, and several of you members in the intervening time had that before you, and we can have discussion first about the scope of services. Yes, Chair Porterfield.
Before we go into the scope, may I ask two clarifying questions?
Yes,
on what you just
absolutely.
said? Question number one, so if we modify the mayor's contract, are we using the exact same lobbyists as the mayor, or, because my understanding is that there's an umbrella, so are we using some of the lobbyists under that umbrella and the mayor's office is using a different set of lobbyists under the umbrella?
What I would propose, so there is the umbrella firm, that is the only firm they are using. So they have not activated any of the subcontracts. There is a subcontract with Morrison Capital Strategies, with Theo Morrison, and that contract is a current contract but not activated. Ms. Darby, did you want to clarify?
And technically, it's not a subcontract.
Oh, I apologize.
It's an independent
thank you.
contract. Metro went through a procurement process to procure this specific contract, utilizing very similar scope of services when they went through that procurement.
But ultimately, the mayor's office will have a set of lobbyists and we will have a lobbyist.
We will have an individual lobbyist that reports just to us, in service to us. So as that independent contract, very good point to make, it was procured by the mayor's office, but the departments served are Metro-wide. And so it is not the intent of the mayor's office to activate that separate contract. And so it's just sitting there at present with a life on it to 2027. And so what we're suggesting, or I'm proposing, is to activate that contract, but amend it to be, have a specific scope of services for the council.
Thank you. And then my last question is, what happens when, I guess, how do we determine what we as a body are lobbying for? Is that determined by the executive committee here? And if this body is divided on an issue, are you then the dividing votes? I'm just thinking of instances where the body has been divided and we just want to make sure that somebody's lobbying for us, that we're kind of on the same page.
Right. I think the way I am, and you'll kind of see through the scope of services, but the way I am thinking about this in year one is that we are in a more relationship building and tracking, relationship building proactive on the legislative side of the house, little more kind of tracking, defensive, but we I think can in time move to some more kind of proactive efforts on the legislative side of the house. But I do think we're needing to kind of position ourselves first as a separate lobbying entity, right, that is defending our policy. And that may be, this body passed a resolution recently. If we pass a resolution, that is the will of the body, right? And so that does express the will of the body. And I think for contracting purposes, and that's something we'll need to kind of vote on today as well. So it's sort of the pathway to procure this contract, what we're going to do by way of kind of method, right? Understanding the time frames and what the advantages and disadvantages, but also then as drafted here in the scope of services to your question, Chair Porterfield. The scope of services, if you look at that first sentence, the firm or individual awarded a contract will act directly to promote, oppose, amend, or influence any legislation identified by the Metropolitan County Council through its executive committee and vice mayor, the representative, right? And so anybody who's contracted for us is going to need a singular point of contact or representative. I am beholden to you all, and you all are representative of the larger body, right? And so I'm not going to get out in front of this body. I am accountable to you. We will establish a reporting system. But I think it will behoove us for our effectiveness that we are working through this committee and myself as the primary point of contact, rather than, if you could imagine, from our 40-member body, people individually kind of pinging our lobbyist for a particular purpose. So the proposal and the scope then would be through this executive committee with myself as the representative.
So let me clarify the question.
Yeah.
There was legislation to reduce the size of the council.
Correct.
From 40 members down to no more than 20 members. The vast majority of the body was against that. You had a few council members that were supportive of that.
Right.
So so my assumption is that the executive committee are the ones that would vote on the position that we're going to take. In the event that the executive committee is split, are you making the definitive vote? I just want to be clear on their process.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Ms. Darby, we are a group of 10. And so as to a splitting vote, would I then recuse myself and then the dividing vote? I mean, if we were trying to make a decision on how we were going to pursue something that might be contentious within the body, is that?
I think you are a group of 10, you have a vote here as well. And I think that if the vote came down to a tie, whatever that motion is would fail. It needs to prevail. So a tie would be considered a failing vote.
So the vice mayor would not break the tie?
There is no tiebreaker in here because we're a group of 10.
Oh, I see. Is vice mayor part of the 10 or is vice mayor 11? I see.
Each
Okay.
member has a vote.
So vice mayor would have already had the opportunity to vote on it. Okay. All right. Thank you.
But I think to your point, Chair Porterfield, about the size of the body, right? We are a 40-member body. I think to your point, there were members who had a differing opinion, but I think that was sort of the problem, right? Is we did not have our own lobbyist. The mayor's office was choosing not to engage on that conversation. And so the appearance that then gives to our partners on the Hill is that we do not have a unified position or approach to that. Where is Nashville on that? And so I would say anything that is very particular to, like, existentially to our existence, that's something, we would take up in here and, make a determination on that. And, we're looking then as well to whomever we choose to contract with us to have their ear to the ground, to be aware of that and understand kind of the nuance of the conversations that are happening. And I think that was what was unfortunate last session, because there were, people who, did not have this body's, best interest at heart, that had the access, right, to whisper in a variety of ears and say, council wants this, or actually, actually nobody's, but what they really want, no. We need somebody to speak officially on our behalf, and that is part of what I think has, we've been talking about this for several years as a body, but I think that was absolutely a tipping point, somewhat, so.
Thank you, Vice Mayor.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am, yes, Ms. Stiles.
So my first question is in regards to the independent RFP process. And how was that done? And is that possible to be extended in other areas? Is it confined only to this particular situation?
I think that would be a question for Ms. Darby, but yeah.
Hey, I figured I'd
So
just said.
you're asking a more general question about procurement? Well, I think for departments that are contracting services.
So the contract that we're talking about, it went through the purchasing department's regular RFP process that is laid out in the procurement regulations and in the Metro Code. So, regularly departments seek contracts through purchasing and they go through this 90 to 120-day process. This went through that already back in, I want to say 2021, probably was when the process happened. And a contract was let based on that. I think what Vice Mayor was talking about earlier was that when we were talking about the different avenues to get to a point where we could execute on a contract, one of them was, should we just do, as a governing body, do our own kind of procurement process? We would still have to follow competitive, a competitive path.
We might have been able to compress the
Yeah.
timeline,
We
but
might have
then
been
it
able
requires a
to.
3-reading ordinance, so when you
Yes.
look at both of them, through procurement would be longer, but our own process would still be quite
Equally as
long.
But both are competitive. Everything would be required to be competitive.
Okay, and
follow-up?
sorry, second question was, so the existing contract that we thought was expired, but actually isn't, this is with.
Or we thought was canceled.
Cancel, okay,
We had been
canceled.
told by the previous administration that they were going to terminate that contract.
Okay, and they
We
did not.
operated under that presumption. They did not terminate that contract.
And this is with Mr. Morrison.
Correct. Morrison
Okay.
Capital Strategies. Yeah,
Gotcha.
yeah. Pro Tem. Ms.
Yes,
Suara.
ma'am. So, and I think the question came about because of it's canceled, it's not canceled. What are the terms of this contract? Is it based on the hours worked, or is it a fixed amount per month? And the reason why is because if they're not in session, right, we still expect some things to be done for us according to the way that I'm reading this. And so if somebody had a contract that they thought is still alive and they're working and they're bringing something, so how are we structuring it in a way that is not confusing so as to be able to decide, and I just a thought process through that. How was it done before? Is it based on the work that the person does? Is it based on the hours? Or is this just something that just says, we'll pay you $2,000 every month?
No, well, the scope of services is very specific to what is required during session, at the end of session, and out of session, right? There are specific things within the scope, and then it is within the timeframe monthly.
It's monthly. The annual value of the contract is $48,000. The monthly fee, I believe, is $4,000, if I do the math right. And so we would be obligated to pay that amount, the $4,000 a month, if we activate this contract for the council.
And the other part that I wanted to, I'm sorry, is the part about coordinating with the mayor's office and all other contracted government. I think that's very critical because if we have different lobbies, the mayor's office has one, we have one, to make sure that the people going to the Capitol are not saying different things.
Correct.
And so that coordination, I think, need to be stressed in a way that what we expect that to look like is not just talking to them, but also making sure that they're in sync, and if they're not, probably let us know where there is a discourse so that you and the mayor can come to terms in terms of that.
Correct. I think we need to be very proactive in that regard, and so while we are explicit here to say that there is an expectation that they maintain those relationships, as your representative, that onus is also on me, right? So I'm not going to solely rely on that person being in touch. I would, presume that in session, as conversations happen about what is being pursued by the mayor's office, I have to be aware of that and share that with you all as your representative for purposes of this contract to make sure that we are not cross purposes. And that's kind of why I said for this starting year, aside from maybe very sort of practical, procedural type policy suggestions or kind of finite, nonpartisan, very practical, everybody accept it, mayor agree, we agree, everybody, like, we might advance some small policy pieces like that. I'm not saying like we're not advancing anything, but I do think in this transitional year, we need to, much as the mayor's office is doing, right, kind of figuring out how we're doing this work and what the priorities are, and then kind of getting a good runway to be successful in that regard. But you know, I think, you know, there could be some concern generally in, you know, when and if and ever in future years, if we do a more general RFP and pursue that, you know, the complexity of working with this body as a 40-member body in a strong mayor system, right? And if folks are cross purposes, because, you know, to be frank, that was sort of the impression previously, right? And so I do feel like this is a little bit of a reset opportunity, right? And if we say within the time frame of this year and this legislative session, with this scope of work, with the new administration, how are we gonna work proactively and collegially? And I think it does behoove us, I would suggest, by reactivating and amending this contract, that's somebody who's kind of been there and under this umbrella already and already reporting to this body. And just sort of speaking from an informational standpoint with some of our colleagues in Memphis at National League of Cities, you know, looking at, you know, Memphis City Council, Shelby County Commission. Mr. Morrison does work with the Shelby County Commission, so he has worked directly with the legislative body. So I think that commends this approach.
My last question.
Yes, yeah. Is it a follow-up question or do I go?
Well, okay.
Okay, let's go to Ms. Sepulveda. She's waiting. Yes, Chair.
Two questions. Similar to Councilmember Porterfield's question, right? So we did it. I think it's a perfect example. We had 4 colleagues that we know of who were up at the state ledge lobbying, right? So if this body decides, you know, to move one way, and then we have colleagues who are doing something at the state level, in this reporting mechanism, will we receive that report?
Yes, I mean, I think we should kind of keep on top of that. I mean, I would expect that whomever is lobbying for us, if they are aware of that, they share that with me, and
Because we can't stop our colleagues from doing anything, but at least knowing what's going on, I think is something that we would.
I mean, kind of going back to what you were saying, our lobbyist should be reporting what's happening up on the hill, back to us, to come back down to this body. But I don't know that they would know specifically, you know, what conversations other council members might be having with legislators. They're not going to be able to interject themselves into those communications, if that makes sense. But if they find out about something, surely they would report
I mean, I would
back.
set that expectation with whomever we're working with. Like, I would expect to know, like, who are you seeing up there? Who's lobbying on whatever? Like, are my members up there? And I would then have a conversation with those members, right? Y'all are all independently elected individuals. We are stronger together when we are organized, and being cross purposes in that way. Again, they are free to do so, right? I am not going to constrain them in their speech as individuals and citizens of Tennessee. I guess I would ask them to be mindful of what that projects about our body if we are cross purposes in that regard.
I would still like to know, I mean, I do, right? But I think a wider body knowing what's going on would be wise. Because I had reports from lobbyist friends who were telling me what was
Right.
going on up there.
And, you know, I've shared before, you know, in various years, understanding or hearing through the grapevine from our former colleague, Jeremy Elrod, like, oh, I think they're trying to do a caption bill on sidewalks. Like, oh, okay, why am I finding out that randomly through our friend Jeremy, right? So I think just sort of level setting on a degree of proactiveness, you know, that was a very fraught time, and for dearth of leadership and organization, it was unnecessarily kind of contentious and problematic. So I think it would be my intent to be made aware of that from the perspective of, like, let's figure out how to work better and do better, right? I mean, I don't know if I'm gonna say specifically on a scope of services, like, I want you to report to me but again, just in a general awareness of what's going on up there, I can absolutely ask, as your representative, who among our body have you seen on the Hill?
Walking around.
Right, walking around, I mean, I think that's just important for general awareness, right? There's a line there, but,
My last, and I know that some of our colleagues are lobbyists themselves, that's different, right? But I guess my last question is regarding priorities and what this body decides. Are we gonna give opportunities to council members to come and speak to the executive committee to see if something should be added as a priority, asking us to do so? Because in my, plan for the next 4 years, there are like pieces of legislation that I want, worked on, not just in Davidson County, but across the state, to be more unified as a force when the state inevitably looks at it and potentially tries to, go around us and change it and preempt us. So, if there is somebody from the council body who's not in a leadership position, if they are able to come and speak to us.
absolutely. Any member is always free to reach out to me to request to speak to this group, and as well in your roles as chair, right? You are probably going to be having conversations in committee where you see like, oh, well, actually, this is a state thing, right? I do have the expectation that you all as chairs are keeping track of that, right? Like what wall are we hitting for lack of state enablement, or, is it preemption? Is it the whole field is preempted? What is it? But, understanding kind of the will of your committee and your colleagues, like in that space, what are potentially some policy goals, whether those be local or they have a nexus statewide. So I think, Chair Sepulveda, I would just offer as an example, when I was chair of charter, historically, in my service in the body, it was sort of like you just sort of waited for what was sort of handed down from the mayor's office, right? Like, these are the things we're doing. We absolutely have to be collegial and mindful of the things that they want to do, but I also initiated a process wherein we emailed to the council, we inquired what some of their desires were in that regard, we vetted that up through committee. I intend for us to continue to operate in that fashion. So while I don't maybe have a specific recommendation for how we would do that, that's absolutely the spirit of how I'd like to work, so.
Thank you.
Yes, Chair Evans.
Assuming that if we're intending to vote today on the options that you mentioned, would we be confirming that, like, let's say we voted in favor of Mr. Morrison, would we be confirming that he doesn't have something that already scheduled for his own lobbying efforts that's in conflict with
Yes.
our perspectives?
When I became aware of this opportunity, and then we found out through procurement that contract was not canceled, prior to touching base with Mr. Jernigan to see if the mayor's office would be amenable to us amending that contract in a friendly fashion, right? So it's metro-wide applicable. I guess you can hostilely amend something. Obviously, we're not here to do that. I did also reach out to Mr. Morrison just to make sure that his understanding was the same as ours, that we had become aware that this was not canceled, that it could be reactivated, and would he be amenable to us pursuing this pathway? And he did affirm that as well. So again, affirmed that with him as an option, and then with Mr. Jernigan that they would be amenable to us then basically taking that piece, and that's just for us now, right? So the contract is metro-wide through 2027. The amended language, which I would propose that we send to you all, would, I think, have to kind of indicate if activated by this council, this body, whatever, as written, all that other language will be in there, but there will basically just be a trigger that, when activated, this scope of services is what is forward and required, and that person is just working for us. So it's very clear, they're not working for the mayor's office, right?
But that they're also, I guess and kind of leaning into that, it's not, I guess I want to know, who else is he lobbying for? I know you
Correct.
mentioned like Shelby County, and so would he provide a list to you of here's all the other agreements that I have in the areas of interest for these other organizations?
Absolutely. I think that is necessary. This, I will tell you, to be frank, this was kind of late breaking about this contract being reactivatable. So, yeah.
Okay.
If I may, I'm gonna have to excuse myself.
Yes.
I didn't mean to interrupt, Erin, if you were still, but
Oh, no, you're good.
I just wanted to share that I think the approach of going under the umbrella of the existing contract and amending that makes a lot of sense, timing-wise, so we might revisit this in a year.
Absolutely.
But I don't see another way for us to get somebody on the Hill when they start session, so
Right.
I would be voting yes if I were gonna be present for the vote, but I do
Okay.
have to excuse myself.
Okay.
Will we have quorum if he leaves, Vice Mayor, or do we need to vote before he
We can
leaves?
vote now.
We do still have course. Is there a motion, maybe?
I move that we go forward with your plan, Vice Mayor.
Okay. Is that an appropriate motion, or are you
Can I
articulate?
say this?
Yes,
We don't have
David.
enough people without me, I'm sorry. I have to go.
Your
Oh, you did.
motion is to approve moving forward to utilize Metro Contract 6506601 for government relations services, incorporating the attached, or the scope of services before you, and identifying the vice mayor as the primary contact and representative of the council through the executive committee through the duration of the agreement.
So moved.
And second?
Okay. Is there
Question.
any discussion?
Oh, yeah, there's
Yes,
discussion.
yes, Yeah.
It says for the duration of the agreement. I know that the original was up to 2027.
Can I actually, I misspoke. It's
Okay.
the duration of the engagement.
Okay,
So we will
Correct.
have a specific.
so we would have a specific time frame
I
that we want.
appreciate that, and I did express that today as well, that I think because we are acknowledging this is a transition time, going forward, this council may want to pursue independently creating the RFP, going that, but again, in these transition years, the runway that you need for that with a new administration, and just operating from a place of experience, collegiality, compatibility, and actually not being behind this session. I do think the spirit of that, understandably, is like, okay, let's take this year, let's evaluate it. How do we want to maybe amend our scope? Do we want to, amend the contract and continue with that? We'll absolutely have an evaluative moment. So to the extent that we need to formalize that we are coming back to this committee at the, at the end of that engagement for evaluative purposes to determine. But yes, there's no presumption that this is going to extend through the life of the existing contract timeframe. We are going to engage for a year-ish, and we may even need to think, because the way these cycles fall, like right now, the holidays, the start of the session, like we may actually want the engagement to end November 1, and then, if we have been evaluating and been in conversation and decide, well, maybe we're gonna approach it a different way, then we've got a longer runway. We can start in August and start to kind of, but not get caught in the lurch. So I appreciate the clarification. Thank you. So there is a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? Okay, all in favor, please say aye. Aye. It shows all members present are voting aye. Okay. Yes.
I did not want to put this in the conversation so that it won't delay the vote. But I do think that I just want to make as a form of suggestion, and Madam Chair could already be thinking about that, is that actually having a letter to the legislative body indicating that we do have a council lobbyist that officially represent us might actually help towards some of the things that is being discussed about somebody else coming to say their position. They're not representing us as a body, but we do have someone that, after talking to this body, we will be passing whatever our stance is on the legislation, and that will be our official representative. And I think it will also be good for the general body to also be aware of that, and you will be letting them know. And if there's a way, one of the things that I've also seen is that we get this report and we read it and we put it aside. I would suggest that we don't want our meetings to be long, but maybe not Mr. Morrissey giving us a report on the floor, but maybe Madam Chair, if there's something of substance that we are pursuing, we're taking a stand on, to put it on record.
Yeah.
So that everybody knows where we stand as we
Well,
progress.
and I do appreciate, it's, you have a report, I would say the report this last cycle was better, it was more tailored. But even so, that report gets sent to 40 members. I do think it's incumbent on me to make sure I read the report right, what is bubbling up through that, sharing that in executive committee or with the larger body, for members' awareness. This is what we're seeing. You may have heard about this in the news. Our lobbyist is addressing it in this way. There will be a hearing. I am going to call on Chair so-and-so and myself. We will be testifying at the hearing. Just a little more proactive communication with the council. And so I will not rely solely on the person with whom we contract to do that. As proposed and voted and approved here, I am your representative, so I do think it's incumbent on me to communicate with the body so that we're not all just at cross purposes reading about stuff in the newspaper or whatever. I just think we need more proactive communication in that regard, and I appreciate the point.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, members, I know we've got another committee getting underway, and so with that, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
All right, we are adjourned. Thank you.